The tour continues. We've done models, we've done controllers, and that leaves only views. And as with models and controllers, there's more than one way to deal with views. And as with models and controllers, I'm going to show you the way Rails does it. I'm going to show you at least one other alternative. And we'll talk about why you might make different choices for different situations. So we're going to talk about template views, which is a specific way that we can handle views in an MVC app. So basically, what problem are we trying to solve here? We know that browsers display HTML. That's what they do. So whenever we return stuff that is going to be user-facing, that's the format we have to use. The question is, how does the data that we're storing in our app become HTML? And again, if you've done any kind of web programming with other frameworks, you've probably done a few different variations of what people call template view, which we're going to explore next. In the template view pattern, basically you have a view that consists of a certain amount of fixed markup, stuff that does not change no matter what the request is. And then at runtime, you interpolate selected data into that view template. So for example, there might be a generic template for displaying information about a movie. And then at runtime, whichever specific movie is chosen, that information gets substituted in or interpolated in. So one example is you have a bunch of variables, and the values of those variables get instantiated into the code or into the template at runtime. You might have little short bits of code that are embedded in the template. And back in the olden days, that was pretty much the whole app, right? If you look at especially some of the earlier PHP apps, they sort of start out being HTML, HTML, and then the little % sign, and then there's some code, and then there's more HTML. And over time, what happened is that the HTML became tiny, and the code that got embedded in them became huge. So this is not a great way to keep your app easily manageable. So we're going to do it according to the model view controller way of doing it. We're going to use a templating system called Haml, which I'll introduce you to momentarily. And how do these template views really work if you follow MVC? You take a templating language in which you express your HTML or whatever templates you want, and you take a closure. We've already talked about closures. Now they're making a reappearance. Closures are your friends. Why? Because a closure is an environment containing a bunch of state, including things like variable values, which you can then interpolate into your view. In the case of Rails, there's a module of Rails called the action view module. It contains rendering logic that is able to do this. It can combine fixed markup that you provide with other data that you interpolate. Basically, what you do is you pass it a closure. And I'm going to prove that to you in a moment. And the output from the renderer is the final HTML page ready to serve to the end user. There's another templating system, which is actually the one that really comes standard with Rails. That's called ERB, for Embedded Ruby. We're not going to use it because, as you know, I have an obsession with putting the fewest number of marks on the page to get something done. And Haml does a much better job at that, as I'll show you in a moment. But ERB ships with Ruby, and essentially it's very much like PHP, where by default you put HTML content in there, but you've got a way of saying, for this part of the content, substitute the result of running some Ruby code or interpolating the value of a variable from Ruby. Again, alternatively, whenever you make an architectural choice, you're ruling out some other choice. What would you do if you weren't doing template views? Well, another possibility is you do a transform view, which is a little bit more radical. In a transform view, you have a collection of information. We're just going to say a closure that represents what you want to display to the user. And you have a bunch of data items. And there's really no intermediate template that they're filled in with. For example, what would be a way that you might use this? Suppose that what you're really doing is generating JSON or XML, both of which we're going to learn about a little bit later in the course. But there are other data representations that are portable across applications and across networks. In that case, it doesn't really make sense to have a template that you fill in. What you're really doing is getting data in one form, the way it's stored in the database, and converting it or serializing it into a different form, like XML that you might transmit to another service. So the idea of a template doesn't really make sense in that case. It's really more a transformation from one format to another, hence the name transform view. So in fact, we can use both, right? When we're creating our apps, and again, thinking of the app as a collection of services, when a user interacts with it, template view is used because we want to provide the user with HTML pages with which a human being can interact. But when that same set of services is accessed by another program, in other words, when we're participating in a service-oriented architecture, really we'll end up using something more like transform view so that we can feed a transformed version of the raw data back to some other service. And we'll show examples of how you can sort of trivially, with a one-line change, make your controller methods do double duty on those things. So The markup system that we recommend using and that we've sort of settled on for the exercises in this course is called HAML. I think it stands for HTML Abstraction Markup Language, but the creator's name is eerily similar to the acronym HAML, so you might look it up. It's pretty interesting. I think of it as HTML on a diet. What are some salient features of HAML compared to regular HTML? Well, instead of HTML tags with angle brackets, we use percent signs to indicate the tags. And instead of nesting the tags, we use indentation. So if you've programmed in Python, this should look familiar. The indentation level tells you what the scope of each tag is. So for example, here I have a table. What's the scope of the t head element? It's basically everything down to this point, because that's where the indentation level resumes. And the entire table goes all the way down to right before this last line that says link to. Right? So indentation is used to indicate scope. What else? We saw how the CSS attributes, or the HTML attributes class and ID, are very heavily used for page styling. So HAML gives you a nice shortcut where you're allowed to put a dot and a CSS class on an element, or you're allowed to put a hash mark and a CSS ID on an element. You've got ways to interpolate code into the HTML, or into the HAML in this case. You can put a hyphen in front of a line, which means execute this code, or you can put an equal sign in front of a line, which means substitute the result of running this code directly into the template. So what's the difference between those? In this case, movie.title, well, I want to actually get back a string representation of that and make that part of the page, whereas in this line, really all I'm doing is starting a for loop, right? I'm starting an iteration. The iteration itself doesn't have any output that's interesting to capture. So it allows you to do both, right? The hyphen means don't interpolate the output, just run the code. The equal sign is do interpolate the output. And if the code overflows onto more than one line, you can use a vertical pipe symbol at the end to indicate that there's more than one line of code. HAML makes it deliberately awkward to do that, because the real thing is you shouldn't be putting code in your views at all. The code really doesn't belong in the part of the MVC whose job is to show information to the user. The code belongs in the controllers and the models, really mostly in the models. So HAML sort of goes out of its way to do a little social engineering about this. It's deliberately awkward to do a multi-line bit of code because it's trying to send you a signal that that code really is somewhere that it shouldn't be. So did I say don't put code in your views? Don't put code in your views. Syntactically, you're allowed to. And in fact, the multi-line mechanism in HAML, you could put an entire novel's worth of Ruby code in there. But MVC advocates for a reason that views and controllers should each be thin. The view has a limited function in life. It's to present information to the user. If the view is operating and manipulating that information, you should ask yourself, why is it doing that? If it's doing it because there's a new computation over that information that turns out is interesting, that maybe should be part of the model, because what models do is manage the way the information is stored and manipulated. If all you're trying to do is make it look prettier, for example, you want to display a price, and it's coming back as a floating point number, but you want to have a dollar sign and the right number of decimal places, well, there's something called helpers, which are basically a special place to put methods whose only function in life is to help make things pretty for views. They're not central to the model. They're not central to any computations you do on your data. They're only there so you don't have to put cluttered code into your view. And helpers should also be pretty small. As I mentioned, there's also the embedded Ruby templates. They look a lot more like PHP, which all by itself is a reason not to use them. But the real reason to use HAML, it's fewer marks on the page. It's easier to follow the indentation. It's easier to debug. And once you get used to it, it's kind of like reading haiku. You get kind of hooked on the elegance part. I recommend it.